All right, so we got the recording going. Couple of things. So do you guys have a preference on whether we start with the nutrition stuff? Do you want to start with parasites? Do you want to just organically go through both of them? Do you have any kind of preference on what is more what you feel is more applicable to you? I mean, they're all kind of interwoven in different ways. And after we go through some of that, if we have a little bit more time, I'll show you how I do some of the how I sell my products. So how I source them, how I do all the stages for that. So you guys can see anything that you might want to duplicate there. You're also welcome to become an affiliate for my products. So if you like any of the stuff that you've purchased from me, whether it's the infrared panels or the Shilajit, I might be doing it for the color kit. I'm not sure if I have to figure out what I can do for pricing there. But if you're interested in any of that, I have pretty good deals for people who want to do the affiliate thing. Anyway, so let's start by talking about nutrition, because there's a lot of different nutrition paradigms that are out there. And what I want to start to kind of talk to you guys about is looking at it from the standpoint of function and of the, rather than kind of the propaganda and the marketing that are in the mainstream media. So when we look at nutrition, there's a couple of different paradigms that we can start to look at. Is our body basically needs two things. It needs information and it needs energy. And what we want to be thinking about when we think about nutrition is how does our body translate information and how does our body move energy? So we have a couple of different cycles that our body basically follows when it comes to the quantum physics of how our body uses electrons. So when we look at the more fundamental levels of how our body interacts, there is, our body basically just uses protons and electrons. So with all of the mainstream saying, oh, we need to eat more protein or we need to eat more carbs and fat, most of that stuff is very surface level. So when our body looks at the arrangement of the only difference between fat, protein, and carbohydrate is how the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen are arranged in the chain of that molecule. So all three of those are all made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. In the same way that all of our cells have an outline around it that is made up of water, so hydrogen and oxygen. And something to keep in mind when we look at these molecules, when we look at water, water is diamagnetic because hydrogen is positive, water is negative. And the reason that we want to know that is because that diamagnetic property is why the water and or the oxygen and hydrogen are attracted to each other from the beginning. And that also explains why certain reactions will begin to happen in our body, just understanding the mechanisms that are in play with what hydrogen and oxygen do. So when we look at the physical cell, in the cell we have our mitochondria, and I'm sure a lot of you, if you've done any biohacking work, you're familiar with the fact that our mitochondria are what produce energy in the body. When our mitochondria are dysfunctional, they effectively are doing two things. They're not producing as much ATP, and they're not producing as much water. So what happens is when you have a cell and you have hydrogen that is crossing the cell membrane, hydrogen basically crosses the cell membrane through a process called proton tunneling. And that proton tunneling is effectively what propels the cell through time. It's what basically causes a vibration of sorts that causes actions to happen in the cell. And as that hydrogen tunnels through the cell membrane, there's a receptor site on your mitochondria called the ATP synthase. And the ATP synthase is an enzyme which is a turbine. So when you have hydrogen that binds to that turbine, it causes the turbine to spin. But we have a couple of issues in people's bodies that inhibits that ability to spin. So as that ATP synthase spins, it generates a magnetic field. The more effective that magnetic field, the more effective the cell is going to be for producing energy. Most people, when they are dehydrated, they have a lot of heavy metals, there's a lot of toxins, and they're drinking tap water or just water with fluoride or other contaminants in it. What happens is instead of your cell getting H2O, you get D2O. And so D stands for deuterium, and deuterium is an isotope of hydrogen. And what that means is it can literally do all of the same mechanisms that hydrogen can do. Oops, let me make sure that I'm spot here. It can do all of the same mechanisms that hydrogen can do, but it has an extra neutron in the nucleus. And so because of that extra neutron in the nucleus, it's actually heavier as far as the moment of inertia compared to hydrogen. So when deuterium gets into the cell and it binds to the ATP synthase, the turbine actually spins slower. And what happens is, as that happens in the mitochondria use that deuterium, it depletes deuterium in the cell, producing water. However, when that deuterium binds to that receptor and the turbine spins slower, it generates a smaller magnetic field. So less water is produced, less energy is produced. Now, as we look at that mechanism, we have to think about, okay, what causes our mitochondria? What do our mitochondria actually use to produce ATP? What do they use to produce that magnetic field? So the magnetic field is produced because of the hydrogen binding to the ATP synthase. The energy that comes in is from the electrons that are being taken from oxygen. So all of these different things that are happening, when we look at oxygen, when you take an electron from oxygen, you're going through what's called a redox reaction. So our redox potential is a measure of our ability to take electrons from oxygen. And what happens over time when people have heavy metal toxicity, they have parasites, they have all of these different things that are happening, their system starts to effectively hemorrhage electrons. And I'll talk about that when we get into the toxins and parasites in a little bit. So if our body is hemorrhaging electrons, it's effectively going into a low redox state. And that means it's not able to interact with oxygen the way that it's supposed to. Now, when we're thinking about how that works, when we then say, okay, so I understand how the cell is supposed to work as far as producing energy, what does that mean in terms of the outside of the cell and how things come into the cell? So there's a couple of different mechanisms that are at play here. I'm not going to go too in depth with the Krebs cycle, because you can basically Google Krebs cycle or the rest what oxidative phosphorylation is, which is the process that your mitochondria use to produce energy. And effectively what that'll look like, actually, you know what, I might be able to bring that up. Let me share my screen and then I'll talk about it a little bit. Cycle. Images. Let's see if one of these will work well enough that I can use it as a maybe. Oh, I guess my internet is running slow at the moment. Let me see. View, open image. There we go. All right, let me share this real quick. Of course, now you're not even going to be able to see it because it's transparent. But all right, so yeah, that's never going to work. Let me find a better one. Let's try this one. Oh, go away. All right, so hopefully you guys can you guys see that image on there? Yeah, cool. So this is a little bit too complicated for what I actually wanted to be. Yeah, it's a little bit too complicated. I'm still not finding the image that I want to show you guys. There should be a little bit of an easier one. This should be a little bit better. Let's do this one. All right, so we got a couple of different things, and basically these are the mechanisms that happen inside the ATP, and this is our respiration cycle. And so what's happening is when we are inhaling and exhaling, we are having different mechanisms that are happening as part of our respiration process. Different types of foods are going to release more or less carbon dioxide, and we need that carbon dioxide in order to absorb nutrition. And what happens is when we are using stressful metabolic pathways, our body's going to deplete the CO2 and not be able to then absorb the oxygen into the cell. And we need that oxygen in order to produce energy. So rather than talking about, let me cancel that because it's going to be more confusing than helpful. Let's look at the different pathways that these different nutrients take. So first thing in the morning when we wake up, there's a couple of things that need to happen as far as our circadian biology. So when we wake up first thing in the morning, our body, our liver specifically, needs sugar. It has over 100 actions that our liver takes and quite a few enzymes that it needs to produce first thing in the morning. And the only way that it can produce those enzymes is if it has sugar present. When the liver does not have sugar, it's still going to get sugar from other places. So you hear a lot of buzzwords like autophagy and gluconeogenesis and these kinds of things from like carnivore circles or keto circles and some of these people who are talking about this. And what these people don't understand is those are stressful metabolic pathways. So in the morning, the sun comes up, we get a red light component as an infrared component, and that triggers the mitochondria in our brain to start producing energy. It says, hey, it's time to turn on that engine. And then the signal goes to the liver saying, okay, we need to turn the thyroid on, but we need enzymes in order to turn the thyroid on. So it goes to the liver to say, hey, we need to produce these enzymes. And the liver's like, well, I don't have glycogen. If I don't have glycogen, I don't have energy. So I need to get energy. And so that then sends a signal back to the brain to say, hey, there's no sugar in the liver. We need to get sugar. Can you help us? So a signal then occurs in the brain that triggers the adrenal medulla to start producing adrenaline and cortisol. So one thing that happens first thing in the morning, our brain spikes cortisol to wake us up. So cortisol is effectively what wakes us up in the morning, gets us out of bed, that sort of thing. When cortisol is not paired with sugar, it is also what causes the adrenal cortex to go crazy. It's also why you want to eat before you have coffee, and I can talk about that later. For the way that it causes the jitters and all that kind of stuff because of the way that it triggers those stressful metabolic pathways. So now we have the adrenal cortex that's triggered. It's producing adrenaline. It's producing cortisol. Well, those are not the components that our body uses to get sugar. They are just the thing that triggers the components. So this adrenaline and cortisol go down to the kidneys. And the kidneys then are triggered to produce ammonium and lactate. And ammonia is excitotoxic. And that ammonia being excitotoxic is going to burn out a whole bunch of other stuff. It's basically what is jittering about those stressful pathways, is the NH3 that gets produced by our body. The other thing that's produced is pyruvate. And pyruvate is pyruvate. Is that right? I might be saying that wrong. Well, I'll correct it later if I'm thinking wrong. But that's produced. And what happens is that is used to break down our body's muscle tissue. So the pyruvate basically is, oh no, it's not pyruvate. It's lactate. That's what I was thinking. Lactate and ammonia. Yeah, lactate. So sorry, I knew that was off. So the kidneys produce lactate and ammonia. And the lactate is what triggers our body to start breaking down our tissues. So that lactate basically triggers our muscle tissues and our fat tissues to start breaking down to release salt, sugar, amino acids, and water. So when we are running those stressful metabolic pathways, when we're fasting first thing in the morning, when we're on a vegan diet, when we're doing keto, the reason that we have fewer cravings, the reason that we're less hungry when we're fasting that way, is because our body is actually going through a process called gluconeogenesis or autophagy, and it's breaking down your own muscles. So that lactate is what causes the autophagy to occur. It's what causes that gluconeogenesis to occur. So what's happening is that stressful pathway triggered by adrenaline causes the kidneys to release those different metabolic hormones. And as the muscles are broken down, your body's like, I'm not hungry because I'm getting sugar and amino acids from my own muscle tissues. So it distorts the ghrelin and leptin signaling that tells you you're hungry or full because of the way that those mechanisms are working. So what's happened is you've now broken down your muscle tissues from that metabolic pathway, and now you have sugar that can go and replenish the glycogen in your liver. So now your liver can produce so there's a couple of things. So I'll answer that question in a second. Let me get that open so I can look at it. In the morning, so autophagy is not necessarily good or bad. It is when you are using chronic stressful pathways. So just because so what I'm talking about here is nutritional stress, but all stress is going to trigger those pathways. So the more that you have stress in your life, we have a limited capacity with which we can deal with stress. So once we hit that threshold, we are just going to be running out of the building blocks that our body needs to do those pathways. So when we look at like keto, when we look at some of these other nutrition paradigms that are claimed to help people reset, what's happening is temporarily those stressful pathways are spiking their cortisol. It's spiking their adrenal hormones. And so they feel like they have more mental clarity. They feel like they have more energy. All of these things are giving them a false positive signal because they don't know what true energy actually feels like. And true energy actually is a calm feeling, not a manic high energy feeling. And so what happens is when we trigger autophagy at any time, your body's basically saying, hey, I don't have enough energy from outside, so I'm just going to break stuff down that I've stored so that I can use that energy from inside. Now you might say, well, that's a good thing because I want my body to burn off fat. So if I'm not giving it energy, it'll burn off fat. It's like, no, fat's hard to burn. So the first thing that your body's going to start doing is breaking down the muscle tissue to get in, converting that muscle tissue into sugar, and then burning the sugar no matter what. So whether it's taking in fat, it's taking in protein, it's taking in all these things, it's ultimately still going to be converting it to sugar because our cells ultimately need that glycogen. The Krebs cycle, and I couldn't find a good image for it, unfortunately. If you look at the different metabolic cycles, when you use fats and protein, they have 3 extra steps that they need to go through before those electrons are available to the cell. Versus when you use bioavailable carbohydrate like sugar or honey, all of these different things, the sugar gets converted directly to the pyruvate, and that's the word that I was mixing up there. And that pyruvate gets converted to acetyl-CoA, and then that gets broken down for the phosphate group and the acetyl group from that to create the ATP. So when you look at autophagy, the marketing and the propaganda behind it is always that it's recycling cells. So you're basically taking broken cells and recycling them and repurposing them. That's propaganda and it's bullshit. Our body, yes, it can break down and recycle old cells, but that's actually what apoptosis is for, the cell death that our cells are supposed to undergo. Taking a cell and causing it to explode and then taking the ingredients from it is a process that requires a lot of energy. So just because you can get energy from it, you end up having to break more down than what you're actually using. And over time, your body has a limited supply of a hormone called pregnenolone. And what happens is you end up living through a syndrome called pregnenolone steal syndrome, because that pregnenolone is effectively the building block for a lot of our steroid and sex hormones. So cortisol, adrenaline, all of these different things. So when we're running these stress hormones chronically, that's part of what causes that adrenal fatigue. It's part of what causes the kidneys and adrenals to have all of those issues. So when these pathways are running all of the time, and we have that adrenal fatigue that's showing up, it's always pointing us back to the fact that, yeah, you're using that autophagy, you're using all of those pathways that are supposed to be good for you, but people don't realize those pathways are triggered both from world and life stress, not just from nutrition. When we look at EMF, and I'll talk about that more when we talk about parasites and bacteria, when we look at EMF, the EMF is opening and closing what are called voltage-gated calcium channels. So it's basically an electrolyte channel that is effectively what opens and closes the valves, whether it's for our muscles or it's for any kind of contraction that can happen. It is what starts to cause the body to release calcium. And the EMF triggers that, and there's a lot of toxins and endotoxins that trigger that. And when you have that calcium that gets released from the cell too frequently, but you don't have enough magnesium, those are not balanced inward and outward of the cell, and you end up getting calcium deposits that stick to the cell membrane. And when you start to get toxins and heavy metals, you start to get other calcium, all of these things start to clog the cell membrane and its ability to proton tunnel. So the hydrogen going across the cell membrane just cannot happen. And as that happens, you start to dehydrate the cell. You start to have a cell so all of our cells communicate with light. And when that cell becomes dehydrated, it can no longer send those pulses of light correctly. And you end up having a cell that has a light arrhythmia, effectively. And so this light arrhythmia starts sending this SOS signal. It's hemorrhaging electrons. And that process doesn't make it to the brain. So the brain doesn't see this SOS signal. And so instead of this cell dying like it's supposed to, it replicates. And suddenly you have two cells that are hemorrhaging electrons. And so all of these things are from it's a combination of the distortion on the structure of water around the cell. It's also from the toxins and things that are in the cell membranes and in our bloodstream and all of that. So when we look at the different nutrition and pieces of this puzzle, we want to be looking at it from the standpoint of energy and information. So when we get information is light. So when we look at EMF, when we look at our light diet, all of these things are what structure the water around our cells. And it's that structure that the DNA matches to know what hormones, proteins, and enzymes to make at different times of day. So first thing in the morning, we are supposed to get infrared light, we're supposed to get red light, we're supposed to get those components of sunlight because it creates a circadian chain reaction in our cell to structure the water in a certain way to tell to produce testosterone in the morning, to tell to produce leptin at the right time, to tell to produce melatonin in the eye. All of these different things need to be produced in the morning to turn on the thyroid, to turn on all of these different mechanisms. And while the body can still make those things turn on, when you're distorting your circadian rhythms, your body's not producing the right hormones at the right time. And over time, that's where a lot of those diseases and illnesses start to come from. Now, when you look at the logic behind sugar versus fat, so sugar is generally our number one fuel source. Whether we're eating anything else, our body effectively breaks everything down and converts it to sugar to be able to use for those various cycles. Now, when somebody is saying, oh, our body can be fat adapted, yes, we can trick our body into producing ketones. But if you look at if you actually do some research on what ketones are actually toxic byproducts of lipid peroxidation. So what's happening is, when our body is running these stressful metabolic pathways, our body is not only breaking down protein, it's releasing fat from our tissues. Now, when our body is hemorrhaging electrons, when it's losing these electrons due to inflammation, it has all these toxins that are upregulating inflammation. It is causing, it's effectively causing let me start over with that. So the, let me think of the best way to say that, because it's a little bit confusing. When you're constantly using those stressful metabolic pathways and you're depleting your ability to break those tissues down, your body ends up releasing too much reactive oxygen from the cell. So when you don't have enough hydrogen as part of the water structure around the cell, because you have too much too much EMF, you have too much heavy metal toxicity, all of these different things break the hydrogen bonds in the water around our cells. And what happens is we don't have enough hydrogen available for the water and the oxygen that gets released by our mitochondria as it's producing energy. So when you're doing exercise, when you're doing these things, it's releasing reactive oxygen species. And if we don't have the hydrogen available to bind and create more water for that reactive oxygen starts stealing and basically burning tissues in your body because it's very electronegative. And as it starts to burn those neighboring tissues, that is increasing inflammation in your system. And when we have those stressful metabolic pathways running simultaneously, our body is releasing fat from our tissues. Most people, because they have been eating unsaturated fats most of their life, whether they've been eating vegetables or they've been eating fish oil or they've been eating chia seeds, or this huge list of what contains unsaturated fats, and there's a lot of stuff with unsaturated fats, the majority of the fat in our tissues is unsaturated. So when our body releases that into our bloodstream, those unsaturated fats have carbon bonds. And those carbon bonds, when they are exposed to oxygen or heat, which our bodies are 98.6 degrees, they immediately oxidize. So that's where that lipid peroxidation comes from. We just released all these fats into our body. This oxygen is here, and we just created lipid peroxidation, which is hydrogen peroxides, and they are indicators of oxidative stress in the body. So they're effectively increasing that oxidative stress, and as that increases, you just keep ramping up the inflammation in your system, and you keep dehydrating the tissues. Well, then your gut stops working, then your muscles start to have aches and pains because they're dehydrated. All of these different things start to surface because of the metabolic stress that your body is undergoing. Adrenal fatigue absolutely is going to affect circulation, body temperature. So when you're running stress hormones, your hands will be sweaty. You might have trouble regulating your temperature. So if you randomly get cold, if you get sweaty, especially cold sweats, all of those kinds of things are symptoms of running stress pathways as opposed to running native energy pathways. And what happens is, over time, when we have continued to shut our liver down, when we've continued to shut those systems down, our thyroid stops getting the signal correctly to produce the high hormones at the right time of day. And as the thyroid stops getting those signals, it stops producing thyroid stimulating hormone, it stops producing certain mechanisms, and then effectively your body doesn't burn fat through its natural pathways. So the thyroid stimulating hormone is meant to be what releases fat stores from your body to burn it at a certain rate. And when we're constantly running those stress hormones, the timing that our cell is trying to follow is thrown off. So effectively, what we want to look at here is if we're looking at where does our body get energy and information. So if it gets 99% of its energy from sugar, then making sure that our body is getting that bioavailable sugar first thing in the morning so that it is able to turn over the motor to get everything else going. So ideally, even if you're going to use the benefits of intermittent fasting and try to detox or do some of that stuff, it's much better if you eat most of your meal first thing in the day. So there's so many people who do that one meal a day or do intermittent fasting and they go most of their day without eating, but that's going to trigger really bad stressful metabolic pathways. It's actually much better for your system to to do your meal at the beginning of the day, and then cut your eating window down early, and then allow that to go through the evening. So a couple of things to think about. When your body is in a low energy state, it is going to be storing more fat. So it's going to use its energy for other things. So a low energy state is a starvation mode, is going to cause that body to store. Whereas if you're giving your body more energy, it is going to not need to store as much. The same way, if you're drinking a lot of water, your body's not going to store as much water. Whereas if you're dehydrated, your body starts to retain water. And we can talk about salt and some of these other things too, if you guys want to talk about that. But the other piece of this that people miss, most people are thinking, well, if you want to burn fat, then it's calories in versus calories out. And that is really far from the truth. Mainly because when you look at it just as calories in, calories out, you're forgetting that the body is more likely to go the path of least resistance. So if your body it's much easier for your body to get sugar and other things by breaking down your muscle tissue than it is for it to actually, it's much easier for it to lose weight and get energy by breaking down and getting water, salt, and amino acids from those muscle tissues than it is hoping to get those same things from fat. So the best way to actually burn fat is to not leave your body in a low energy state, but to put your body in a high energy state so that its mitochondria and things can work better. So what happens is you have a couple of mechanisms that people miss beyond just energy in versus energy out. You have what's called NEAT, and that NEAT is called non-exercise activity thermogenesis. And you also have the thermic effect of food. So the thermic effect of food is the fact that the more you eat, the more energy it actually takes to digest and burn that food. So the same thing happens with non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So as we are going throughout our day, there's other factors that are at play. So the more that we eat, and I don't remember, I'm going to make these numbers up, but the ratio is you'll get the idea of what I'm saying here without using the exact numbers. And if it's interesting to you, I can actually look them up. But there was some research done. So some of this stuff was taken from Eat to Perform. But there was some research done that showed the difference between doing a 500 calorie deficit just by itself, doing a 500 calorie deficit plus cardio, and then doing a 500 calorie surplus plus cardio, and how many overall, I think it was how much overall calories that the person burned, and also how much fat they ended up losing because of that. And long story short, the people who actually were on a calorie surplus while exercising more burned more energy and fat than the people who were on a caloric deficit. And the reason for that is they're putting their body in a high energy state. And your body, what I usually tell people is, if you're eating for performance, if you're eating so that your body has the maximum amount of energy, then it's not going to look like it's low performance. So it's very hard for a high performance body to look low performance, but it's very easy for a low performance body to look high performance, which you'll see in a lot of folks, obviously, on Instagram, because there's plenty of low performance bodies that are not looking that way. But what you'll find is, if you're giving your body enough energy, one, your brain is going to work better, your body's going to work better, your sleep is going to be better, your digestive system will work better. And the more energy that you give your body, the more it's just going to use. It's like it's a computer in that sense. When you give your computer more RAM, it uses more RAM, whether it's running more applications or not. And so the same thing kind of happens with our body. And so that's a good time to transition into talking about some of the bacteria and parasites. So when we have parasites in our gut, when we have bad bacteria in our gut, all of these things are effectively eating our food. And when they are chronically eating our food, they're stealing our energy at the simplest. But they also convert that food. And so when they eat the food, they're releasing byproducts as part of their digestive process, the same way, we release byproducts. Some of those byproducts are, they'll release endotoxin, they'll release waste products. And one of the other things that they release are pulses of light. And so they've been measured to release pulses of infrared light. When you look at that paradigm and you look at the different types of parasites that are in our body, each parasite is going to release both endotoxin and pulses of light that are going to structure the water around our cells in certain ways and tell it to produce different hormones, proteins, and enzymes, which effectively is going to cause us to desire or crave certain foods that feed those bacteria. So a lot of those different bacteria, a lot of those different parasites are going to be, they eat inorganic iron, they eat unsaturated fats, they eat vegetables. And so when you look at the fiber in those vegetables, they're being eaten by those bacteria to create soil in our gut. And that's effectively what they do in the soil itself, is they're taking the fiber in the soil and digesting it. And that has turned into the propaganda of how to alter the things within us, because the same thing happens. When they're doing genetic modification of these different plants and animals, they actually genetically they modify an E. coli bacteria with certain information, and then they implant that E. coli bacteria, and that releases the pulses of light and endotoxin, whatever else, to create the modifications to the plant DNA. The same thing is happening in us when we're ingesting those kinds of things, because all of those different endotoxins, all of those different medicines that are, or not medicines, all those different chemicals that are in our body are going to tell our body to produce different anything, whether it's hormone cravings, desires. And it, when you look at it and it changes the structure around your cell, it's effectively altering your perception of life. And so it can change your emotional state. It can change your the way that you think. It can change how you interact with things. It can change what you're afraid of. All of those things can be created by your gut biome. So a couple of weeks ago, I had talked about the belly brain. And so how the belly brain actually sends more signals to our cranial brain than the cranial brain sends to our belly. And so a lot of that occurs in the small intestine, but also in the large intestine, and how it deals with parasites. So there's a couple of things that we want to think about. So there's brain parasites called Toxoplasma gondii. Those brain parasites are kind of crazy because if you look them up, they actually are mind-controlling parasites. They were originally discovered in rats, and the cats would chase rats, catch the disease, and it would actually cause them to be more sexually aggressive. And there was other stuff that it did. But it caused a whole bunch of different things, because the sexual aggression is what caused the parasite to spread. And that's actually, I think it's like 1 in 4 people or 1 in 10 people have that parasite in general. It's not super difficult to kill with a lot of the other stuff that I've used. And there's helminths, there's worms of all kinds, and everybody on the planet, if you've ever had vegetables, if you've ever gotten food poisoning, if you've ever if you have pets, all of these different things, everybody is going to have parasites. I don't care who you are. Everybody's going to have them in some capacity. Some of them are visible, some of them are not. What I usually recommend people do with these is start with coffee enemas. I find that is the best way to get your body to get, it's a great way, one, to support your liver. So when you do the coffee enema, there's certain acids, palmitic acid and a couple of other ones that are in the coffee. And that coffee hits the portal vein, and that then causes a nerve to be stimulated that triggers the liver to contract. And that contraction causes the liver to release bile. And bile is very acidic. And so the parasites that so the first place the parasites tend to go is in our bile ducts, because they want to clog those bile ducts to make sure that they can survive. So what happens is when those bile ducts are clogged, our body doesn't release enough bile when we're digesting. And so we can't break down fats, we can't break down certain things in our digestive system, and we get irritable bowel, we end up getting gut inflammation, all that kind of stuff starts to happen because our body is not creating enough stomach acid, it's not creating enough bile acids. So what happens is we want to we basically use that coffee enema to trigger the liver to release bile. That bile kills the parasites that are in the bile duct, and then all the parasites on there out. And so now your body just basically starts ejecting bile that it hasn't recycled in a very long time. So the body recycles bile. So you basically are creating bile to digest, and your body reabsorbs it. Now, if you have toxins in your system, or you're eating things with endotoxin, that the bile absorbs some of that each time, and all of that gets stored in the gallbladder, all of that gets stored in the liver. So when we do the coffee enema, it allows your body to flush that toxic bile that usually has not been flushed in a really long time. It usually smells pretty foul when the body does that. And so it'll be super yellow. You might go to the bathroom a couple of times that day just to clear that stuff out, because your body will basically eject a lot of things. And you might have liver flukes. You might have some of that kind of stuff that'll show up, and those will be kind of like red flake-like things. They're pretty distinct that you might see in your liver. A lot of people have those liver flukes, and that really alone makes a really big difference just by clearing those out. I tended to get a body high just by doing the coffee enemas that way. Once you've done the coffee enemas a little bit, you'll find that you have cleared a lot of that stuff out. My body pain feels way better. In my brain, all this different stuff feels way better when I'm doing those regularly. I had taken some time off. I did them probably every day for about 6 months. Then I took some time off, doing them maybe once a week, once every other week. This past week, I picked them back up to do. I've been doing it every day the last 4 days or so. And it really makes a big difference on how my whole body feels. It helps my if I had any bloating, it helps any water retention. It helps just any little aches and pains that I might have been feeling. Sometimes it removes a restriction I didn't even know I had. So it helps a lot with those kinds of things. What I'll do after I've done the coffee enemas, there's a couple of different things that I'll add to the enema. So I'll take some of the supplements that I'll take are lumbrokinase. I'll take serapeptase. I'll take nattokinase, N-A-T-T-O, nattokinase. These are all systemic enzymes, and they're proteolytic enzymes. So they help to break down fibrosis. They help to break down calcification. They help to break down biofilms and protein deposits, all of that kind of stuff. And so what I'll do is sometimes I'll mix those into the coffee enema or just take them. I'll orally take vitamin E. So we were talking about lipid peroxidation. And so one of the side effects of all this lipid peroxidation is that our body starts producing more tissue estrogen. So we end up having phytoestrogens, we end up having tissue estrogens that keep coming up. And that's part of what causes muscle contractions not to work properly. So taking the vitamin E, taking aspirin, both work to increase our body's acidity. And by doing that, it increases our stomach acid and our bile acids, not our body's acidity. And so a lot of times when people have low stomach acid, it's going to cause it basically will cause parasites to survive digestion that would have been killed in your stomach acid. But what the vitamin E is going to do is it's going to be effectively an antioxidant specifically for lipid peroxidation and fat oxidation in the body. So as our body is clearing these unsaturated fats, because we want to clear them anyway, we don't want to leave them in our system, because when those unsaturated fats are paired with iron, they basically oxidize and form a substance called lipofuscin. So the lipofuscin is basically a photopigment that is a biofilm that coats our organs, and it shows up as those brown photopigment spots that you might see on people's skin. And so we want to use the vitamin E to break that down and clear that from our system. The parasites also, so when we have all those parasites in our body and they're eating all of those heavy metals or eating all that inorganic iron, they are effectively, there's a couple of things that are happening. So when you're eating vegan, when you're eating vegetables, when you're eating, those are probably the two most prevalent places. Or when you're just breathing in bad air, there's heavy metals everywhere. So we're constantly inhaling heavy metals. We're constantly drinking them in the water if they're not being filtered out. You're getting them if you're eating vegetables, you're getting heavy metals. You're also getting endotoxin. You're also getting unsaturated fats just by eating those vegetables. And over time, those heavy metals are inorganic minerals. So the difference between an organic mineral and an inorganic mineral is the fact that an organic mineral has a carbon bonding to it. So it's basically got a CH group, and that carbon bonding allows methylation in our body. We are carbon-based life forms, and so if we don't have that carbon bonding to break, we cannot actually take the nutrient and use it in the cell as part of the mechanisms that need to happen. So if we have inorganic minerals that we're getting from plants and we're getting them from all these different places, we are basically eating rocks that are going to collect in our cell membranes. So what's happening, and this will play into some of the parasite stuff in a second, is there's so much. So with geoengineering, with solar radiation management, with chemtrails, all this stuff, they're basically spraying strontium and barium in the sky, and there's all kinds of pollution. We have acid rain. All of this stuff is in our air. And that water is used to water all of those crops. And it's used to water everything. If you're drinking tap water or spring water, any of these kinds of things are all watered with this water. That water, because it's so acidic, is going to cause the erosion of aluminum and iron from the soil, and that's going to be taken up into the plant. When we eat that, we are just eating all of that inorganic iron, all of those inorganic minerals. Along these same lines, when you go and buy vegetables at the store, especially things like celery and some of these other vegetables, they're literally soaked in tap water, both while they're sprayed on the shelves, but they're literally soaked in tap water before they're even put on the shelves at places like Whole Foods. And so it's important to realize this, that when they're soaked in tap water, they're getting a double dose of heavy metals. They're getting a double dose of all of these different toxins. And so we can talk about detoxing some of that stuff also. Looks like we probably won't have time to go into the selling stuff today, but we'll go into that next week or sometime next week, I think, which will be a better timing for it anyway. But anyway, so we're looking at a couple of layers here. So we've got all of this acid rain that's eroding from the soil. We've got people drinking tap water from this acid rain. You've got companies selling spring water as something that's good for people, even though it's filled with heavy metals. And these same people are also telling folks to eat unsaturated fats. And so now you're seeing this paradigm that's starting to show up, and of where people are told to eat unsaturated fats because it increases oxidation. They're told to eat foods that are high in heavy metals and unsaturated fats that increase oxidation. They're being programmed to be glued to their phones, and all of the phones are doing two things. It's throwing off their circadian rhythms, because people get up in the morning, they look at their phone and they just saw blue light. And so now their body said, oh, it's noon. It's not 8 in the morning. I'm going to produce noon hormones. And so now they have all of these different circadian mismatches that are happening because they're getting their light at the wrong times of day. And then this too, when you have Wi-Fi signals, you have 5G, all of these different electromagnetic signals, whether it's 5G or it's Wi-Fi or it's our phones aren't too bad. But a lot of these things have not only a magnetic field component, but an electrical field component. So what happens is when you look at light, and I had explained this before, different spectrums of light hit the hydrogen bonds in water, and they cause those hydrogen bonds to vibrate in any of 6 different ways. When you look at the magnetic field in our mitochondria from the ATP synthase that I mentioned earlier, you have this magnetic field, and then you have this information from light, and that creates that 3D resonant structure around the cell. Now, when you have deuterium in the cell, suddenly the magnetic field is smaller. You also have EMF, which is, light is EMF. The difference between Wi-Fi EMF and light EMF is that Wi-Fi and 5G have an electrical field component. So the electrical field component is actually perpendicular to the magnetic field. So when you have a magnetic field that's applied to the hydrogen bonds, let's say, those hydrogen bonds orient to that magnetic field. But the electrical field then is perpendicular to that, and then it breaks those bonds. So a couple of things are happening. So we have deuterium that's coming from all the tap water and the acid rain, and we're drinking water that's not actually water. We also have water, because it's deuterium, it's heavier. So you end up getting these water clusters. So in our body, water is not plain H2O. It's like, 6H30O, it's basically huge clusters of water molecules that are put together. So when we use red light, when we use magnetic fields, all of these basically work to structure the water and take it from this chain of water molecules, this cluster of water molecules, and make them into individual flat water molecules, or exclusion zone water, which is the water that's around our cells. And so that is a much smaller molecule that can enter and exit the cell. So as we have all these toxins, as we have all this bad water, we're creating these clusters that can't even hydrate our cells anymore. And causing people to have, and so we're starting to see all these different side effects of this. So people are chronically dehydrated, their inflammation is increasing, their cells are not communicating properly anymore, they're getting chronic pains and inflammation, and most of the old tricks aren't working, and they're getting brain fog because there's so much lipid peroxidation and stuff happening in their brain that their brains aren't working anymore because they're chronically in a low energy state. And all of this is just from these collective paradigms. And so when we start to look at this process, we start to say, okay, so my body needs energy and information. It's going to get energy from the right. It's going to get from the right types of sugar and protein. It's going to get information from the amino acids. It's going to get information from sunlight. It's going to get information from red light at the right times of day. And so now it's getting the right information. It's getting energy. We need the amino acids so that our body can take the information that is in the mitochondria, and it can take those amino acids and arrange them in whatever string or chains that it needs to arrange them in. Most of the time when our body eats food, it's not taking that food and directly turning it into something. It's taking the food as information and using that information to know what activities and actions it needs to do. So it takes the energy and information from whatever food we're eating. Now, if that food has toxins and other components to it, our body can process those up to a certain threshold. But over time, as our body starts having more heavy metals collect, one of the things that happens is called the photoelectric effect. So when we have heavy metals in our tissues, and light or EMF or any of these things, light and EMF are the same thing. So we're sending information to the cell. That EMF is going to cause the cell to start basically creating the metals to create electrons or hemorrhage electrons that are going to start burning the tissues. So we want to take things that can chelate heavy metals. So shilajit is a good chelator of heavy metals. Injecting vitamin C is a good way to chelate heavy metals. Ionic foot baths are a way to chelate heavy metals. All of those kinds of things can be really, really powerful for removing heavy metals from our tissues. There's some other detoxes that can be good for it. I think shilajit and the vitamin C injections are probably the best way to go if you can tolerate so the vitamin C injection is not for human consumption, technically. I think you can get ones that are for human consumption. The injection, the first time you do it, hurts like a bitch. It hurts like a bitch. The second time after that, it doesn't hurt at all. I don't know what the mechanism is that happens the first time, but it really burns. And after that, it doesn't hurt anymore. It's not that bad. But the first time it burns, it does feel really good. I do notice that my joints, a whole bunch of stuff works really well. Oral vitamin C is not real vitamin C. It's not bioavailable. That's why it gives you the shits when you have too much of it. Same thing with magnesium. Most magnesium is not bioavailable, which is why I recommend bicarbonate or getting an amino acid bonded magnesium. So we're all magnesium deficient. So because of EMF, we are basically having, EMF does a couple of things. So EMF triggers those voltage controlled calcium channels that I mentioned earlier to open. When that's chronically opening, our magnesium gets depleted because it's switching places with all of that calcium. And we need to be constantly giving our body a lot more magnesium so that certain chemical reactions and enzymes and things can be made the way that they're supposed to be made. So taking magnesium bicarbonate is a really good idea to get that magnesium back into our system. What was the other thing? So answer the questions about the coffee stuff in a second. For some of the other parasite protocols too. So we have a couple of things. So the parasites and the bad bacteria are going to work in our system in similar ways. I consider all bacteria bad. I consider all parasites bad. I kind of think they're all distorting what my body needs. If I look at like what I was taught in health class in high school, our body uses stomach acid and bile acids and enzymes to digest our food. Never were we talking about this symbiosis with bacteria until the last 10 years, let's say. That is a fairly new concept, and it's one that has been picked up that always makes me go when I'm reading about some of the protocols that they talk about, just because a lot of those different bacteria are completely made up and arbitrary. These companies are selling bacteria supplements that have arbitrarily chosen bacteria in arbitrary amounts, and there's something about it and just the way that people are talking about it that always gave me a red flag. And what I found is the more that I've killed those things off, the better my system has felt. So let's talk about a couple of just specific protocols that you can do. So I already mentioned the coffee enemas. That is one I do all along because it just helps clear stuff out of my system. The cleaner is a supplement that they make for men and women. It is a really good detox supplement. It has a lot of the herbs and things that are good, like wormwood and black molasses, some other things that are in it that are really good for killing parasites. And so just taking that will, it can be pretty strong. So start with the smaller end of the doses. You can get it at Vitamin Shop. You can get it on, I think you can order it on Amazon now. I'm not sure. But the cleaner is a really good one to stack with the coffee enemas. I'll put that in my coffee enemas sometimes. I'll also take it orally. So you can do that. It's good for killing the biofilms also. The other thing that I started doing was doing a pre-wash. So instead of just doing the coffee enema by itself, what I would do is I'd make a water enema. And in the water, I would put a couple of tablespoons, probably like 3 tablespoons of apple cider vinegar. I'd put some colloidal silver. And I had a link, I think at some point, about some biofilm busters. So there's Cystis tea. There is a whole list of different things that you can use for busting biofilms. Like even those digestive enzymes too are going to be really good for that. And so what I'll do is I will do the water enema with some of those biofilm busters in it, and I'll do a rinse. So that, because the apple cider vinegar and stuff in it, it's really tough to hold. So I usually just try and come in, I try and hold it for 5 minutes before I go to the bathroom. And then I'll do the coffee enema. And I find a couple of things. The coffee enema gets a lot easier to retain once I've done the clean water enema first. It also clears a lot more stuff out that way because you're killing off the biofilms that are blocking all the bugs. So what happens is after you've done that a couple of times, you're not seeing anything come out. You have to clear those biofilms because all those worms and things are going to hide behind those biofilms. And their number one goal is to survive. So they're really, really smart about that. They do it really, really quickly. So the other things that I'm going to do, that I would do with that, so oregano orally is really good for viruses. It's really good for parasites and worms. It by itself is not going to do a whole lot, but I will use it with other protocols. What I recommend doing is actually putting it in a capsule and then taking it quickly, because you'll burp up oregano and you'll sweat out oregano, and and it burns like crazy just to put it straight in your mouth. So putting it in a capsule works really well. It also burns going in the other end, and it's an oil, so it doesn't mix super well. So it's not great in the enema itself, but you can take it. It's a good thing to stack. Colloidal silver is a really good thing to add in there. For that same reason. The coffee enemas are not going to stimulate your nervous system the same way as drinking coffee will. It has more caffeine than drinking coffee, but most people who are sensitive to caffeine and the nervous system stimulation don't find that happens when they do the coffee enema. So you'll probably be fine that way. If you're worried about it, instead of doing the 3 scoops of coffee, do 2 scoops and just kind of adjust accordingly until your body normalizes to it, or do less water, that kind of thing. If you're having trouble holding the enema, so if you go in and you immediately have to rush to the bathroom, add baking soda. The baking soda will help it not be so overstimulating and won't make you cramp so much when you're retaining it. And that works pretty well that way. Let's talk about the turpentine stuff. So there's some other stuff you can do once you've done some of these coffee enemas. The turpentine, there's ivermectin and parental, which are basically specifically for parasites. The turpentine cleanse is really, really strong. You basically take a teaspoon of turpentine, a tablespoon of castor oil, and a tablespoon of sugar. And you'll get a brain buzz. It'll probably shit your pants 3 or 4 times that day. Sometimes it'll make you do that. Sometimes it won't. I find that one is I don't know what, it makes my brain a little bit swirly when I do it. But that day, and then after that, it really feels good because it clears a lot of that stuff out. And it does feel, it kind of reminds me of combo. In the sense that combo is a poison, giving yourself a little bit of poison helps your body deal with poison. And so that little bit of turpentine, obviously turpentine's from pine trees. You have the pine cone, which is pineal in nature. You feel it big time in your third eye when you do it. So I don't know if there's other mystical properties of it, but I do know that cleanse has been around for a long time, and it causes your body to just eject a bunch of stuff. Lots of bile, that kind of thing. But it does work really well. It's one that I recommend if you're gonna do it. The brand of turpentine is a Diamond G brand, is the one I've used a couple of times. Organic turpentine is all fine. The ivermectin and parental, what I usually do with those is you don't have to take those very often. They are basically horse and dog deworming meds. They're fine for humans too. You can buy them for humans. It's just way cheaper to get the animal versions. The ivermectin is for worms. And usually what I recommend people do is they take the ivermectin at night, on the night of the full moon, because those parasites and things tend to be more active on those nights. So I find that doing that on the night of the full moon, then I'll get rid of a bunch of them in the morning the next day, and over the course of the next, I think it has a 6-week half-life. So initially what I recommend people do is I'll do 2 weeks in between the parental and the ivermectin. Once you've done it a couple of times, either on the new moon, the full moons, or you've just chosen to do it, I've stacked both. I've stacked kind of all of this stuff on top of each other. There are a couple of other good anti-parasite remedies that I've found on Amazon that I've also added to the coffee enemas. But basically what my process is I'm doing that coffee enema. I'll add some of these other ingredients to the enema that I've mentioned. I call them my butt smoothies, and it works really well. And then I'll also, on top of that, stack some of the oral stuff like the turpentine and the ivermectin and parental for other days to kill off some of those other worms. The colloidal silver, the turpentine, the cleaner, all of these help to kill off bad bacteria. Taking another really good thing to do is apple cider vinegar with some honey. You can even make a mixture of cinnamon, apple cider, honey, warm water. And you could add colloidal silver if you want to add it, because it's not going to hurt anything to add it. And then drink that first thing in the morning. The apple cider vinegar will help with the stomach acid. It'll also, it's an electron donor, so it helps with reducing inflammation. And it also kills off bad bacteria. So it does a lot of those kinds of things. So stacking the colloidal silver with the apple cider vinegar orally, I'll also put that, like I said, in the coffee enema. And I'll take that. A lot of times first thing in the morning is kind of a tea. It's a really yummy tea if you put honey in it. And you'll also feel pretty good doing that, and it'll clear some stuff out, help your digestive system, that kind of thing. I found for most people, I tell them cut out fiber. You shouldn't be eating a lot of fiber. Our body's not designed to digest it. It'll make you constipated, and it'll also get blockages and things in your digestive system. For the most part, what I tell folks is, sugar of some sort first thing in the morning. Honey, maple syrup are really good choices, followed up with a protein source. If you're wanting to do the fasting and whatever, then front loading your day with food is probably your best bet. But you can make it organic, whatever is natural for you as far as your eating schedule. The other piece of the puzzle is when you look at like diabetes, when you look at sugar sensitivity, when you look at these kinds of things, these don't come from too much sugar. What they come from is too much unsaturated fat. They come from too much inorganic iron. They come from high fructose corn syrup. So high fructose corn syrup is basically an undigestible starch, and it has it has an extra group on it, and I'm drawing a blank on what that group is called, at the end of the glucose molecule, or fructose molecule, and that additional group basically is not digestible to us. And so it is the more our body ingests that, the more inflammation that starts to happen as our body starts releasing electrons trying to digest those foods. So it's not the sugar that's the problem. It is the artificial sugars. It's the fake sweeteners that are causing that. And those all ramp up inflammation. When you're ramping up oxidation and inflammation, you're causing the insulin receptors to rust. You're causing them to burn out. You don't burn out a receptor by using it. You burn out a receptor through inflammation. And that's important to know, because when you look at what's happening with those insulin receptors, it's not like dopamine, it's not like serotonin or other chemical neurotransmitters where your body regulates how sensitive those receptors are. It is a receptor that is always sensitive and always exists until the inflammation burns those receptors out. So feeding your body sugar and giving it energy so it doesn't run those stressful pathways allows your body to reduce inflammation and rebuild the sensitivity to insulin and all that kind of stuff. So if I was trying to stay lean without having to work as hard or having to go to the gym and doing cardio and all this other crap, so cardio is going to increase inflammation. It is going to wreak havoc on your system as far as inflammation is concerned. It's why a lot of people who go to the gym and lift weights tend to be really strong and really fat, because that kind of high intensity training is going to create a lot of inflammation when you're pairing that with stressful metabolic pathways. So what I find is what I want to do is make sure that my body has enough energy. I'm going to do the coffee enemas because that helps to detox. It helps to clear out parasites. It helps to clear out heavy metals. As my body clears out heavy metals and parasites, my body isn't wasting energy feeding those things. And that alone can save me a tremendous amount of energy so that I'm not needing to eat as much. I'm not needing to waste as much energy feeding them. And suddenly your inflammation goes down. When your inflammation goes down, your estrogen goes down. When your estrogen goes down, your water retention goes down, and your electrolytes start to balance better. So all of this stuff makes it a lot easier just by kind of flushing the system that way. Apple cider vinegar to drink and for butt smoothies. Less sleep, yeah. So I'll talk about that in a little bit. If I wake up with high blood glucose, should I eat sugar anyway, or should I just inject insulin to get the sugar into the cells? So it kind of depends on, there's a couple of different variables. So if you need insulin to process, I would keep eating the sugar, but I would make sure that you have the insulin to balance that out. So if your body's not producing insulin, it means there's some issues coming in with your pancreas that we want to get working. So the pancreas produces a boatload of enzymes, but the pancreas can't turn on if your liver and thyroid aren't turning on. And so you want to be doing these pathways to get the liver thyroid to turn on so that the pancreas can start producing enzymes. This is also why we don't want to have coffee before having sugar and protein, because we want to make sure that we can actually digest the coffee and absorb the nutrients. And if we haven't turned those on, the coffee gets too far along the digestive system without those enzymes being available. Pierre, we can talk a little bit more specifically about nutrition as it applies to you on the group. If you want to talk about kind of what you've been doing and how your body's been reacting to it, we can refine that a little bit. And obviously anybody who wants to do that, we can talk about it a little bit more specifically on the group, and be able to kind of dig in on, whether it's for you and you're trying to figure out what you're going to eat, or if you're trying to, if you work with clients or whatever, and you want to start to refine how you're communicating this stuff, we can start to work on some of the language. What I wanted to do here was kind of give you a brain dump of too much information that you're not going to be able to use, but at least you've kind of had some, I wanted to give you kind of this high level view of a bunch of different things, so that when we start to discuss some of the other layers, you have a baseline of information that we can really dig into. And that way we can, start to answer other questions about disease, start to answer other questions about these metabolic pathways, and also just see how you guys are reacting to some of this stuff, so I can help you navigate, oh, well, I started having sugar and it started to spike my anxiety. What might be causing that? Or whatever the case is. So there's a lot of different things here. Because I know, Eric, at some point you were telling me you were having kind of like some kind of pseudo seizure type things that were happening. And I don't know if that has gotten better or not, but all right, cool. So I'm glad that's getting better. But we can also talk about that. That's thyroid related. So seizures tend to be thyroid related a lot of times, and the thyroid tends to be related to all the stuff we were just talking about. Also related to salt consumption. So we can dig into some of those little details a little bit also the next time we talk about nutrition. What other questions do you guys have? You mentioned sleep. So let me talk about that before I forget. One of the reasons that your body needs less sleep. So I've done a lot of different research on this, and I'm always experimenting with it. And what I find is when I clear a lot of these parasites and when I do a lot of these protocols, my body isn't giving as much energy and stuff to other things to just create my reality, so to speak. So my body has a lot more of that energy. And when it has a lot more energy, it's more capable of repairing. It's more capable of doing activities throughout the day. And that then allows you to be more efficient when you sleep. So if you have parasites that are doing activities on top of the fact that your body's trying to repair, it's trying to normalize, it's trying to process dreams, what's going to happen is your body is effectively having things dancing inside of it while you're trying to sleep, and that's going to cause your sleep to be at a higher level. So a few things that happen. So when we have parasites release histamine. And when we have a lot of histamine in our body, we might be addicted to cannabis. We might be having these things up because cannabis is an antihistamine, and that shows up in that sense. And so we want to keep killing off those parasites to reduce all of those different levels. That will also allow us to sleep deeper. When we can sleep deeper, we need less sleep because our sleep is more efficient. And that's kind of the goal. Is it's not about getting a tremendous amount of sleep. It's about making the sleep we are getting more effective, so that we're not having as many disturbances. We're not sleeping as lightly throughout the night, those kinds of things. And so what I found is, as I killed a lot of those things in detox, I actually felt way better sleeping less. I was way more creative. My energy felt really good. I wasn't crashing. The only downside is you have a really long day. When you add another 2, 3, 4 hours of time to your day, that is a lot of time. And so you end up being like getting a lot of stuff done first thing in the morning and being like, okay, now what do I do? So there's trade-offs to it also that way. But what I find is like I'll do that and I'll sleep maybe 4.5 to 6 hours, and I'll do that for probably a month, and then I'll go a week or two where I'll sleep a little bit more because my body's processing stuff, and then I'll be able to cycle that again. But I do find that when I sleep too much, I'm more likely to be tired than if I sleep a lot less. And some of the research that I've been doing around that was, I always wondered, because I see people like Da Vinci and I see people like Tesla and like other just visionary thinkers. So some of these people who were getting incredible ideas and were just so forward thinking compared to the rest of the world, all of these people slept between 2 and 4 hours a night. Couple of things happen though. A lot of these people were just psychiatric disasters. So obviously when you're not sleeping as much, it's going to throw off your neurotransmitters. So I imagine what's happening is because they're not sleeping, their neurotransmitters are not reprogramming and re-regulating each night the way that they're supposed to, but they stay more active and more open in different ways. So different portals start to open. And so suddenly all these people are getting a lot more insights, they're getting a lot more downloads, they're getting all these things, while at the same time, they're missing a certain filter that doesn't allow those processes to happen as readily. So I imagine, and I haven't tested this tremendously, but one of the things that I've noticed on a lot of my, just even my ayahuasca ceremonies and different things, when I go a long time without sleeping, I am way more tapped in and way more creative, but there are also other sensitivities that happen. So I become more emotionally sensitive. I have other things that start to come up. And a lot of times they are emotions I want to feel and clear. And I just wonder that the people who become more emotionally distraught and have more psychiatric issues are just people who are having all of these traumas and emotions come up to the surface and not knowing how to process them. And I imagine that as you do a lot more of that process, less sleep will allow you to effectively interact with your world better without it being as distorted that way. Now, I don't recommend doing that necessarily, but it's interesting information I'm still experimenting with. I just got a different sleep monitor, so I may just monitor it and see what my body's actually telling me rather than me just guessing about how I feel. Because it's possible I was sleeping, those 4.5 hours and my body's just running stress hormones and other stuff. And I feel okay, but my body's just tanking. So I have no idea what the ramifications are of that. I know there's trade-offs, people who sleep a lot more tend to die younger. People who sleep less don't. There's also some tribes in, I don't know if it's South America or I think there are island tribes. There was a belief in one of these tribes that I came across where they only sleep 20 minutes at a time. And their reasoning for that is their belief is that the more you sleep, the less yourself you become. And so they actually are afraid to sleep because they believe they're more themselves when they don't sleep. Now, I don't know what the health issues of that civilization are or any of that kind of stuff. And one of the things that I studied in college, I took a class on death. And one of the papers that I wrote was on circadian biology and was writing about basically a study where rats were flown from LA to New York and back several times in a week. And because it distorted their circadian rhythm so much, most of the rats ended up dying just because they were so out of sync with their local time. And so the way that our body synchronizes with that local time is due to the magnetic fields that are present in our local space. So the Earth has a part of our atmosphere called the ionosphere, and the distance between the Earth and the ionosphere creates a resonant container, a resonant tube, basically. And that resonant tube generates an electrical field that produces lightning. It produces all this stuff. Well, all of these lightning strikes that are created in this ionosphere create an EMF wave that's created in our specific location based on the distance from the Earth to that ionosphere. So based on your elevation, basically. And so when that is different, our body synchronizes to the what's called the Schumann resonance, which is the resonance given off by the ionosphere, the electrical field in the ionosphere. Our body synchronizes to that locally, which is what tells us how to know what time it is in our biology to synchronize to our circadian rhythms. So when we're traveling back and forth and getting jet lag, part of what we need to do is actually get synchronized to the local time by walking outside barefoot, by getting grounded, and being able to conduct those signals by getting sunlight. There's other pressure points and things on the hands too that can tell your body what time it is, just by either using the color puncture tools or by pinching that. I think I mentioned that at one point. I need to dig that image out. I'm not sure where it is, but I'll see if I can find it. And go that route, because there's some really there's a lot of really cool things about our circadian biology that start to come up, and you notice in people's illnesses that most illness is a light arrhythmia. When I'm talking about nutrition, if light is information, our body just needs that information, we're getting the wrong light, or our light diet is off, then our whole system is not going to work properly after that. So it's really important to get that sunrise sunlight or the red light first thing in the morning, to tell our body what time it is, and be able to sequence that. Let's see what else we asked here. If I wake up with pasta, bread, yogurt. So I tend to avoid pasta and bread, mostly just because most pasta and bread are going to be sprayed with glyphosate or Roundup. And whether it's organic or not, it tends to be sprayed with that stuff right before harvest to make it easier to harvest. And so when that stuff is sprayed, that is filled with endotoxin. So a lot of those different breads, a lot of those different pastas are very endotoxic, and they're going to cause inflammation and things in your gut. They're going to throw off your hormones. There are some sprouted grains that are okay, Ezekiel bread and that kind of stuff that can be okay. I'll eat bread, like if I get burgers and that kind of stuff. I really don't worry too much about it because I don't feel it too much in my body. When people are having like celiac, or they're having gluten intolerance or some of that other stuff, all of that is an endotoxin problem. It's a parasite problem. It has nothing to do with that protein not being digestible. That's a down the line side effect of those kinds of things. As far as yogurt, if you can get raw yogurt, if you can get grass fed stuff, that's the way to go. I don't eat much yogurt because I try to keep my bacteria down as opposed to adding more bacteria. So I haven't been consuming like as many fermented foods like kombucha, but if your body feels good eating them, then listen to your body. So a lot of those have good bacteria in general. So you have to also kind of balance the equation a little bit. I don't think it's possible to completely kill all of your bacteria. If your body feels good eating that, if you find that your body digests stuff better, or you just feel better doing that, then stick with it if it's already working. Otherwise, I don't eat it too much. I'll eat raw milk. So if I'll get bacteria and enzymes and things from the raw milk. And I'll do that regularly. It's one of the best things you can do. The yogurts are fine in general. I guess you could probably, like I said, it's up to what your body digests and tolerates well. As far as other carbohydrates, you can do potatoes, you can do rice. If those don't digest well, or give you gas, then cut them down and don't eat as much. Just replace it with other forms of sugar. Bioavailable sugar is really what your body's asking for in any case. So you don't necessarily need potatoes or other things, as long as you're getting your nutrition from obviously red meat itself. One of the reasons that red meat has more bioavailable nutrition has to do with the fact that all the minerals in the red meat are carbon bonded. So they're able to be assimilated into our tissues. The argument that people make is that, well, if there's all this acid rain and the cows are eating grass, why don't the cows have this issue? Well, the cows have 4 stomachs. They have different enzymes and abilities to digest fibers that our bodies are not able to digest. And they can break down inorganic minerals and things that our bodies are not able to digest. And so they're able to metabolize them differently into their tissues in a way that we can't. So when we eat that red meat, it has a lot more bioavailable nutrition than any fruit or vegetable that you'll ever come across. And so there's a lot of that kind of stuff as far as nutritional density in that. If you're eating red meat, if you're eating, taking Shilajit, if you're getting your vitamin E, all of those things should be pretty darn comprehensive as far as nutritional densities. Magnesium also. You're getting kind of the full spectrum of stuff. You don't need that much else. So you're getting the protein and fat from the red meat. You're getting it from grass-fed butter. If you're eating those kinds of things. You're getting your sugar from maple syrup and honey and whatever other ones are digestible to you. Keeps it simple. The simpler you eat, the simpler your meals are, the easier your body has a time of just digesting. It doesn't have to work so hard. And what I do is I don't worry about it too much. So if I'm having, if I'm going out to dinner with family, if I'm doing other stuff, my body can handle it. So I kind of keep most of my nutrition pretty simple. And then when I'm going out, I don't fret. I eat what I want. We'll have a normal meal. I'll eat snacks every once in a while if I'm craving them. I really don't want to, I want to be able to live my life. I don't want to live in fear of every food. I don't want to have all that stuff happen. And I find that if I'm getting salt, if I'm getting sugar, I don't have cravings because I'm giving my body the energy that it's asking for. So all of those are important factors that we want to think about. For salt, I recommend starting just with a 1/4 teaspoon before bed. So you'll find you'll sleep a lot better by doing that. Just doing a 1/4 teaspoon, and you can level that up or down. You'll still eat it with your food. I think most people don't get enough salt, or their salt is depleted just because of calcium issues. You will retain water like crazy initially. If your body has been getting salt from its own tissues, so if it's been breaking its own tissues for salt, what's going to happen is your body's going to not know what to do initially. And so it's basically going to start retaining water. It's going to start, you're going to be starving because your body is like, oh, I'm not going to break down my own tissues to get this stuff you're giving me outside. And so now it's like, feed me, feed me, feed me. So there will be this little bit of a transition period as you start doing the salt that your body will get bloated, and you'll be super hungry all the time. Trust that process. Your body will renormalize in probably a week or 2 or 3, depending on you. And that will feel way better once you've kind of reset that system, so that your body stops eating itself and it starts eating the things that you're actually feeding it. And that'll also help reset some of your leptin and ghrelin sensitivity so that your body is giving you the right signals of whether it's hungry or not. What else? What other questions do you guys have? I know there's probably a million of them just based on the stuff that I've kind of brought up so far. If you guys want to just start kind of digesting some of this stuff and trying it, and then we can come back with some more questions over the next week or two, or do another video or something this week to dig into it a little bit more. Well, otherwise, if we don't have any questions, I'll let you guys enjoy the rest of your Saturday evenings. And obviously, if you think of something, you can just send me a message or post it on the Facebook group, and we'll go from there, and all that stuff. So coffee enemas later in the day, okay. I tend to not do them later in the day. It's possible that they would keep you awake. Obviously, the caffeine doesn't stimulate the nervous system quite so much, but I would probably not do it super late in the day. I tend to I've done it as late as like 2, 3 in the afternoon. So if that answers your question, I wouldn't do it like in the evening, but you're fine to do it in the middle of the day. I've certainly done them. I've done a couple now that I think about it. In the early evening, like 4 or 5 o'clock before, if I'm super detoxy. So if I did an enema and my body's clearing bile, one of the things that can happen when the parasites are dying is you'll get die-off symptoms, which are kind of like flu symptoms. You'll randomly just start sweating and feeling super nauseous. That stuff dying and your body's clearing it out. It's called a Herxheimer reaction or a Herx reaction. What I'll do a lot of times if that's happening is I'll do another coffee enema to flush that out, or I'll take either activated charcoal orally, or I'll take another detox supplement, which I forgot to mention, called Enteros gel, Enteros gel. It's a Russian supplement that's even better than activated charcoal. And what I'll do is I'll take that orally with a glass of water, and that binds to all those different toxins and Herx reactions and all that. And just doing that will help clear the body out if you're having some of those symptoms and whatever. It's a good thing to take regularly. You definitely will have good bowel movements after taking the Enteros gel. It just congeals everything in one go. So it's a good thing to take also. It's a little bit expensive for the serving size. You end up only getting like 4 servings or 5 servings per tube. So I don't do it all the time, but I'll cycle it in because it does help and it does feel really good. So it's worth doing. Alrighty. So if that's all of our questions for today, you guys can certainly ask them on the group. I will call it quits for today. I know this is a lot of stuff, so I think a lot to absorb. But thanks for hanging out, and we will keep going with these. So I'll talk to you guys later.